Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film, as we look at the worksheet meant to accompany the Rise. Now, in number 4, of course, where Hamilton Fish and his friends hope to be remembered as a band of brothers. They are quoting, as educated men would, Shakespeare's play Henry V, which is often quoted in war movies, and indeed has been often given from memory by officers in actual wars, hoping to inspire their men. Um, Number 5, Craig Wadsworth's father goes on thinking his son is a fool to go off and fight in a war. This is probably, though, a pretty unrealistic depiction of Craig Wadsworth's father. Wadsworth himself and his father were historical figures. In fact, his father and grandfather both served in the Civil War. They had not avoided service. Indeed, his grandfather was killed in the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864, and so probably he would not have the anti-war feelings that he expresses here, unless being exposed to combat made him opposed to war. But even then, he probably wouldn't have expressed it in quite this way. Now, number 7, we see that Theodore Roosevelt's wife is named Edith, which is true, and that they have 6 children, which is mostly true. Although Theodore Roosevelt's oldest daughter, Alice, was actually Edith's stepdaughter, having been born to Roosevelt's first wife, Alice. Um, and, um, and Alice and Edith actually had a pretty rough relationship. Alice was pretty wild in general. In fact, when Roosevelt was president, he said he could manage Alice or he could manage the country, but he could not do both. Furthermore, when the Roosevelt children are depicted here and there in the movie, at least in one of the last scenes of the movie, they appear for the most part rather older than they were at this point in history. The youngest child, Quentin, appears to be 5 or 6 at least in the movie. In fact, would not have been much more than 1 year old when that scene is set. Number 12, Roosevelt points out that France violated the Monroe Doctrine by invading Mexico during the Civil War, and that is true. France took over Mexico in 1863, officially because Mexico was not paying off debts they owed to France, Britain, and Spain, but also because Emperor Napoleon III of France wanted to show he had some of the same military skills as his famous uncle. Now, France did not officially keep Mexico. Rather, they set it up as an empire of Mexico ruled by Maximilian Habsburg. But when America's Civil War ended, Secretary of State William Henry Seward pointed out to the French Emperor the United States, right at the end of the Civil War, had the largest army on earth, 900,000 men, whom we could send right over the border if we needed to, and the French pulled out. Emperor Maximilian chose to stay, and some Mexicans were happy to have him, hoping he would bring stability to their country. But the majority didn't want him, and he was overthrown and executed in 1867. The scene also shows Roosevelt speaking not just English, but quite fluent French. And indeed, he was fluent in French as well as German, and passable in Italian. Number 13, Edith Roosevelt approves of her husband going to see the elephant. In the 1800s, to see the elephant was a slang term meaning to do something dangerous and probably not worth the danger, especially meaning to go and see combat. So to see the elephant was a common term for to go into battle. Number 16, Joe Wheeler claims that Nathan Bedford Forrest was a better general than he. It's possible that he was. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a natural military genius. However much we might criticize his personal life, and there's much to criticize there, militarily he was brilliant. Joe Wheeler, though, probably wouldn't have admitted that. Although Wheeler, in principle, was in overall command of cavalry in the area where Forrest served, Forrest refused to serve under his command because of the enormous disagreements between the two of them. So Wheeler didn't like Forrest and probably wouldn't have spoken well of him, certainly not described him as better, even if it's possible that he was. Of course, number 17, where we see Wheeler as a Democrat, is a reminder that Almost the entire South voted solidly Democratic for generations after the Civil War, no Southerner outside of East Tennessee being willing to vote for the party of Lincoln until well into the second half of the 20th century. Number 18 claims the South does not celebrate the 4th of July, and for the most part that's not true. The 4th of July, of course, celebrates American independence and the Revolutionary War, and Southerners loved the Revolutionary War. Of course, many great Southern heroes like George Washington are Revolutionary War heroes. Many Southerners saw the Civil War as a second war for American independence. Although, there are a couple cases where Wheeler may have had a point. The city of Vicksburg, Mississippi really did not celebrate the 4th of July until partway through World War II. But that was specifically because the 4th of July was the date in 1863 when General Grant captured Vicksburg after a long siege, having starved the city into surrender. So the 4th of July is not a happy day in Vicksburg, Mississippi. In number 19, William Randolph Hearst tells Frederick Remington, the famous artist, to furnish the pictures, and Hearst will furnish the war. And this is based on a legend, probably true, that admittedly a little earlier in history, but only a bit, when Remington was on assignment in Cuba, he did send that message, or a very similar one, back to Hearst in America, saying there was no war, at that point the Spanish having largely crushed the rebellion, and Hearst sending back the famous reply, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Number 20 is true. Roosevelt really did order Commodore Dewey to prepare for battle and set sail for Manila in the Philippines just in case war broke out. And so indeed, when he did arrive, he was prepared to fight and sank the entire Spanish fleet in the Philippines, at least in Manila Bay, without losing a single man of his own in combat. Number 22 is true as well. Roosevelt spent some time as a cowboy out west, and although he didn't necessarily look like it, he was pretty tough, and he did beat up people. He went so far as to make fun of his looks or his mannerisms, as he did tend to speak with a pretty stilted upper-class accent and expressions that many cowboys didn't think much of at first. They saw him beat a few people up. Once he was deputized to hunt escaped criminals down. When he captured them after a pursuit of many, many miles, he then at gunpoint made them build a raft and floated back down the river to the nearest jail with his rifle across his knees and a thick Russian novel to read to pass the time. Number 23, where Roosevelt's mother used to make grits, and if they were good and not misbehaving, cheese grits may or may not be true. Roosevelt's mother was a Southerner, which may be one reason his father paid the commutation fee to avoid the draft and not fight during the Civil War, which Roosevelt was always a little embarrassed about. Though while his father played a big role in supporting the war through charitable efforts to help the soldiers, he never fought. Indeed, some of his uncles on his mother's side fought in a Confederate Navy. Some stayed in Britain for many years after the war out of fear they might be prosecuted for piracy for attacking U.S. shipping during the war if they came back to America. So Mrs. Roosevelt may well have liked Southern food, but the Roosevelts were rich, so his mother probably never made any grits at all. If they ate grits, they had servants to fix them for them. Number 27 is probably true. Edward Marshall and Stephen Crane were both real writers. Both worked as war correspondents in Cuba. Indeed, Crane was famous for writing The Red Badge of Courage, to which so many characters in the movie refer. Indeed, Crane had also tried to go to Cuba earlier to report on the insurrection there back in 1897, but his ship had sunk and he barely made it to shore in a small lifeboat, an experience he turned into the famous short story The Open Boat, published the same year. Number 30 presents Indian Bob as a member of the Sioux tribe. It says they're the ones who got Custer. And this is more or less true. Now, Indian Bob himself is fictional as best I can tell, but a number of American Indians did serve in the Rough Riders. Indeed, one frightened many people on the battlefield by letting out an Indian war cry in the Battle of San Juan Hill. Furthermore, while Indian Bob may seem a bit stereotypical, the Sioux Nation themselves liked the movie's portrayal of Indian Bob and American Indians in general so much that they named the scriptwriter an honorary member of the Sioux Nation. Number 31, we see it Sergeant Henry Bardshar once killed a bear because he didn't like it. And that may or may not be true of the bear, but Henry Bardshar was a real person. And the movie doesn't really portray him that fairly. They show him as pretty incompetent in his private life. And that was really not true. He was not a failure in business. His first marriage did end in divorce, it is true, but both that marriage and divorce took place years after he returned from Cuba. He didn't join the army in real life to escape a hen-pecking wife. Number 35 is not really true. The movie portrays William Tiffany as being part of the famous Tiffany family of jewelers in New York. They don't quite say so outright, but they strongly hint that way. But that's actually not true. William Tiffany and the Rough Riders was certainly from an upper-class family, but no relation to Tiffany and Company. And the actual William Tiffany's father had died 12 years before the Spanish-American War broke out. However, the Rough Riders really did have 2 Colt machine guns purchased by several of the millionaire recruits, including William Tiffany, who did serve as part of the machine gun crew. And these Colt machine guns could fire 500 bullets a minute and could indeed tear a man apart over half a mile away. Number 36, we see Delchenay with his pressing duties at the Carlisle Indian Academy. Now, Delchenay himself is a fictional character, but the Carlisle Indian School was real in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where Indians sent their children, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes essentially as hostages, to learn American culture, to learn modern skills and trades. Again, some Indians hoping this would give their children a way to make a life for themselves in a modern world. And others were forced to send their children there, basically as hostages. And in all cases, the goal of the school was to assimilate those children. As one assimilationist put it, to kill the Indian to save the man. Number 39 is possible. The Major Roosevelt Meach would like to discuss his work on a North American elk. And Roosevelt was, in addition to being a politician, well known as an author of books on the outdoors and wildlife. Birds were his specialty, and he had became famous too for promoting the conservation of wildlife so future generations could hunt all the animals he had. As president, he would later set aside more national parks and other parkland, not just than any other American president, but more than all other presidents combined. Number 40 is true. Shafter is as big as a house. He weighed over 300 pounds. Sometimes he had to be lifted with a crane. He was too big to ride a horse, so he sometimes rode on a mule instead, as mentioned in number 54. Sometimes he was carried around on a door, with several soldiers carrying a door like a litter with him on top of it. Even one of Thomas Edison's documentary films of the war makes fun of Shafter's weight in the official description of the film. Number 41 says Atlanta is not one of General Wheeler's fondest memories. That's certainly true. He was among the Confederate officers meant to keep Sherman out of Atlanta. Sherman, of course, got in and burnt it. Number 42 and 43 are true. Lieutenant John J. Pershing was with the 10th Cavalry, was nicknamed Black Jack for commanding black troops. Sometimes went by another name besides Black Jack as well, but the newspapers wouldn't publish that word for black even then. Pershing would later go on to lead all American forces in Europe during World War I, as essentially a 6-star general, although he never officially wore more than 4 on his shoulders. Number 45 shows us that even though they were trained as cavalry, the Rough Riders would have no horses, and that was true. The U.S. military's supply methods were so poor, They only managed to get 2 horses for the entire regiment of Rough Riders to Cuba. One of them, Little Texas, belonged to Roosevelt. The other, I suppose, to Leonard Wood. Number 47, though, is not quite true. Fred Funston does not work for the State Department at this point. He had gone to Cuba earlier to fight in the insurrection, due, I think, to his own personal convictions and desire for adventure. Although by the time the U.S. declared war on Spain, Funston was back home in America recovering from malaria he'd caught in Cuba, and then joined up with the regular U.S. Army. So while Funston was in Cuba at this point, it was not in any unofficial capacity. Still, the United States State Department, I'm sure, did have spies and other agents involved in the insurrection in some way. Number 48. So the West Mediterranean thrush is a native of the coast of Catalonia. And this is based on truth. Roosevelt certainly knew something was wrong before this ambush, which did take place historically. He kept hearing bird calls he should not have heard in Cuba, the calls of birds that didn't live there. So he knew something was going wrong. And he saw a piece of barbed wire that had just been cut. He could tell it had just been cut because the end was still shiny. In a humid climate like Cuba's, it would have begun to rust within a few hours of being cut. So he knew someone had come through cutting the wire. So while his men were ambushed, they were not caught completely off guard. Number 49, where Edward Marshall picks up a rifle and shoots at Spanish soldiers. That is based on reality. Edward Marshall, the war correspondent, really did grab a rifle and shoot at the Spanish. So did another war correspondent named Richard Harding Davis. Indeed, Marshall and Davis's characters are somewhat combined in the movie. Number 50, we see General Wheeler referring to the Spaniards as Federals and as Yankees. This is probably a bit of an exaggeration. They play up his wild character a little bit in the movie, but he did in reality get confused a few times. At least once during the Battle of Las Guasimas, Joe Wheeler really did shout out, "Let's go, boys! We got the damn Yankees on the run again." Number 52 is true. Roosevelt really did trip over his own saber fighting in Cuba. Number 55 is not true. We see the Spanish guns in the movie manned by German advisors. And although the Spanish did use German-designed guns, they were firing them themselves. There weren't any German advisors helping the Spanish in Cuba. Furthermore, the Spanish didn't even have machine guns on San Juan Heights. It's simply their Mauser rifles fired so much more quickly than the Americans' guns that many Americans thought the Spanish had to have machine guns. So while there were foreign military officers in Cuba observing the war, there were no actual advisors for the Spanish from Germany. Number 58 is true. When Wheeler went to the hospital, Leonard Wood took command of the whole cavalry brigade, and Roosevelt stepped up to take command of the regiment. Number 61, where Castillo wants people to think that when things are bad, an American will come to help them. And that may seem idealistic, but in the 1800s, many people in Latin America really viewed the United States as their example of a nation winning independence from a European empire and setting up a republic. And the United States were deeply admired throughout Latin America. Although, after the Spanish-American War, as the United States, especially under President Theodore Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson, became more assertive in Latin America, seeing ourselves as the region's policemen, many people in Latin America, in turn, came to resent the power of the United States, describing us as the Colossus of the North. And of course, Mexico, who had lost almost half their territory to the United States in 1848, had already felt that way for some time. Porfirio Diaz, president of Mexico for many years in the late 1800s and early 1900s, once said of his own country, "Alas, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." Number 68, in which Marshall is shot, and number 79, where it says he's been shot through the spine, are partly true. Marshall was shot and badly wounded in Cuba, although actually not San Juan Hill. It happened a bit earlier during the Battle of Las Guasimas. Accounts differ whether he was shot through the spine or through the leg, but it was not fatal as suggested in the movie. He lived for many years afterwards, although he did have to use a wheelchair. And Marshall must either be the luckiest or the unluckiest guy on Earth, because some years later, having survived, although badly wounded, that gunshot in Cuba, several years later he was in a deadly hotel fire in London. Many people in the hotel died, but Marshall somehow survived. In 1916, during World War I, he was sailing across the English Channel on the French ferry boat Sussex, when the Sussex was torpedoed by a German submarine. 50 people died when the Sussex went down, but Marshall survived that as well. Number 69 is true, or at least it's untrue in the same way it's untrue in the movie. Bucky O'Neill says a Spanish bullet has not been made that can kill him. Indeed, in the battle, Bucky O'Neill was trying to encourage his men, walking back and forth in front of them, smoking a cigarette. One of them told him he was going to get shot, and he said, "Sergeant, the Spanish bullet isn't made that will kill me." Shortly after that, he was shot through the mouth, and the bullet came out the back of his head, killing him instantly. And number 70 is partly true. There is a statue of Bucky O'Neill in Prescott, Arizona, that honors him and the entire 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, but Henry Nash had nothing to do with it. Furthermore, although Bucky O'Neill's gravestone is shown in the movie as being out in the middle of the desert, in fact, he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery, just outside Washington, D.C. Number 73 is based on reality. Roosevelt always carried several spare pairs of spectacles because he was about blind as a bat. In fact, that may have saved his life many years later. He was campaigning for a 3rd term as president in 1913 when a man believed he was haunted by the ghost of President McKinley, approached Roosevelt and shot him, hoping to assassinate him. But it was a cold day. Roosevelt was wearing a heavy overcoat. The bullet went through the overcoat, through Roosevelt's regular coat, through his speech, which was 50 pages long and folded double, then through his steel spectacles case and all his spare glasses. And while it still went through his shirt and buried in his chest as well, it'd been slowed down enough he survived the gunshot wound and even gave his speech to the audience in the theater before going to see the doctor. Although he did take a couple weeks off campaigning after that. Number 77 shows William Tiffany killed on top of Kettle Hill, and that's not really true. Tiffany survived all the combat in the war, but he died several months later of yellow fever while waiting to go home after the Spanish surrendered. And number 81 is more than true. By 1920, Roosevelt's not just not in good health, he's dead. He died in his sleep in 1919. A friend saying death had to take him while he was sleeping. If he'd come when he was awake, there would have been a fight. And also, as stated in number 81, Roosevelt did lose his youngest son, Quentin, during World War I, when his plane was shot down behind enemy lines and he died in a crash. Roosevelt's other 3 sons also served in World War I and went on to serve in World War II, where Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was in the first wave of the attack on Utah Beach on D-Day, with a pistol in one hand and a cane in the other, the oldest man to take part